JFDI to give out the second keynote speech. Let's share how Singapore helps startups and grow and prosper. Let's welcome
you, Steve.
Hugh.
Really appreciate that.
Superstar.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. What a fantastic job you guys have. You get to work and live in places like that. Who wants to move to Halifax? I'm convinced. Yes. We have 3 votes already. And what a fantastic opportunity you have to set up conferences like this where we can all travel to each other's fantastic cities. Please will you invite me? Because I want to see all of these harbor cities, okay? I am not a person who works in local government or a mayor of a city. I'm an entrepreneur. There's a little bit of background about me coming up in my slides when they appear on screen shortly. I'm British originally. I moved to Singapore 10 years ago, and I arrived at a very interesting time. Singapore, for those of you who might know, is kind of a project. It's 53 years old, 1 year older than me, and I was excited by the opportunity to be part of that project and to help to build a new dimension on it, very much building on the foundations of what work like people like Lily Chan, who will speak later on the panel, had been doing before, to create the foundations for entrepreneurship. Together with my co-founder Meng Wong, we set up the first startup accelerator in Southeast Asia, invested about $3 million in 70 startups. 1 in 12 is a hit, meaning there'll be a sort of $100 million business. That's interesting. I pressed the button and it buzzed, and now we've lost the slides. But that's okay. I'll tell you about the journey we had. I arrived in Singapore full-time with my family in 2009, and at that time, the city was a very different place to what it is now. Back in 2009, the country was a place that was very wealthy in terms of financial capital. It still is. There is no shortage of money in Singapore. It was also a place that was very strong in terms of intellectual capital. There's a great education system, lots of smart, talented people. But there was no social capital for entrepreneurship. There was no place where people could come together. And I was really interested to get the opportunity to speak at this event because I think there is something very interesting about physicality and entrepreneurship. There's also something interesting about collective action and entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs by nature are very individualistic people, but in truth they need to come together in an ecosystem to make a change. If they want to be taken seriously in a city, they actually have to have a political voice. They have to make impact so that a mayor or other people can take action on their behalf. And that doesn't come naturally to entrepreneurs. So the first thing that Meng Wong and I did, my co-founder, was to set up a co-working space, the island's first co-working space. And that brought together engineers, people who could make things happen. Because we figured if we were going to do startups, they had to be real. What I'm going to ask our team over there is, would it be easier, guys, if you change the slides for me? Is that easier rather than me trying to press them? I get the impression that when I press this button, bad things happen. Like if I press the really big one in the middle, maybe there'll be an explosion. I see some conversation over there. Okay, let me tell you a little bit more about that as they're working it out. So we got together a group of engineers and makers, people who make things happen, and it was a very interesting experience. We realized that when you talk about something like an innovation ecosystem or a startup ecosystem in a city, there are actually several different groups of people. There's a bunch of people who are interested in making things, physical things. There's a bunch of people who are kind of geeks that are just very interested in technology. And there's a bunch of people who are interested in building businesses. And those groups overlap with each other, but they're not the same. And a critical thing I think that we've learned as we've brought an innovation ecosystem together in Singapore is that we have to bear in mind the interests of all these separate stakeholder groups. Since 2015, I'll hand this back. Oh, we have a new clicker. Fantastic. No problem. Since the end of 2015, in addition to working with startups, I responded to the many approaches we had from corporations around Southeast Asia to try to help them innovate in new ways. I'm sure in your cities too, large corporations are trying to do digital transformation. Traditional business is great, but it's not just cities that have to transform in a new way. Large corporations have to do it too. So a lot of my work has been that. And I have to say, if you're going to make an impact on the economy of your cities, I would urge you to think not just about startups, but to think about digital transformation, how you can apply startup thinking to the larger organizations that are already with you. So I'm going to press the really big button now. Are you ready? 3, 2, 1. I think it might be best if I ask you guys to change the slides. Okay. this is what I'm going to talk about. I was expecting to be able to talk for half an hour, and I'm told I've only got 15 minutes. So let me run through this. If anyone would like a copy of the slides or would like to talk afterwards, be delighted to do that. I'm here until Thursday. So let's move on to the next slide, please. I think many of you in this room who are not working from day to day in the startup ecosystem may be wondering, why is there all this talk about startups? And this graph really says it all. The cost of starting a startup business, the cost of setting up a new technology venture, has come crashing down by several orders of magnitude in the last few years. And that's made it possible for all sorts of people to start creating new businesses. Let's move on. Joe Ito runs the MIT Media Lab, and I'll let you read his quote as I'm speaking. What he basically said is, in the old days, you had to put together a plan. You had to ask for permission to create a new business. All sorts of people had to be involved. That's no longer the case. And to anyone out there who's got an entrepreneurial urge inside them, this is a very exciting time to be alive. Not only is it possible to start a business for very little money, we also now understand how to teach entrepreneurship, and we know how to systematize innovation in a way that significantly reduces the risks. So I think part of the appeal of startups is that it's a very attractive lifestyle opportunity. But of course, a lifestyle opportunity doesn't make an economy in a city thrive. So let's move on and we'll explore that further. This is one of my heroes. Howard Stevenson's a Harvard Business School professor, one of the first people to look at entrepreneurship. And in the 1960s, when he started studying it, in his own words, entrepreneurs were viewed as clinically insane and addicted to risk, right? The 1950s was all about large organizations, centralized structures. And he came up with this great definition that entrepreneurship is the pursuit of opportunity without regard to resources controlled. In other words, entrepreneurs start things even if they don't know how to get to the end of their journey. Let's move on. Now, many of us have a stereotype of entrepreneurship, and Jonathan this morning spoke about how, in reality, the truth about entrepreneurship is very different. It's not about hoodie 20-somethings in a dormitory. These are some of Singapore's most successful female entrepreneurs who came to our office to be photographed for the national newspaper. And not only do they look different from many of the stereotypes, if we move on to the next slide, again, Jonathan this morning referred to this report from the Kaufman Foundation. He talked about some of the statistics about what entrepreneurs are really like. They're older than most people imagine. They're much more diverse than most people might imagine. And the majority of them take 2 or 3 goes to get it right. If you look at that bottom point here, 2.3 businesses before they get to success. So if we want to create a climate for entrepreneurship in a city, it's not just about setting up companies and expecting people to thrive. We have to give people the opportunity to learn. Entrepreneurship's like riding a bicycle. You don't learn how to do it until you fall off. Let's move on. My co-founder Meng Wong put together this theory to explain this. On the vertical axis is your likelihood to become an entrepreneur. On the horizontal axis is GDP or time. In Singapore, if you stepped off the boat from China a century ago, you had no opportunity to do anything other than become an entrepreneur. You had to start your own business. But you made damn sure that your children became bookkeepers, and they made sure that their children became lawyers, and their children made sure that they worked for the government. And when I came to Singapore about 2009, I think we were at the very bottom of that curve. Now actually, over to the right, there is a thing that you might call entrepreneurship by choice. William H. Gates III, Bill Gates to most of you, I believe his mother was general counsel at IBM. He could afford to drop out of Harvard. So could many of those people that you read about in the newspapers. Over here, we see entrepreneurship by choice. Over here, we see entrepreneurship by necessity. I think if we're going to build an entrepreneurship ecosystem, we have to bear in mind the reality of people's lives, which can be quite diverse. Now, some people have put together plans for what it takes to transform a city. I'm sure many of you have read Richard Florida's work. I won't go through his big diagram here of what creative cities are all about, but if we move on, I think there's some interesting parallels between all the noise we heard about the creative class maybe 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, and what we're now hearing about entrepreneurship. A lot of city waterfronts got transformed into condominiums, lots of cappuccino bars appeared. These were all lovely things. But as you can see from Richard Florida's books, I've put them in date order here, we started off with the rise of the creative class, and by the time we get to a couple of years ago, we've got to the Great Reset. And if we move on to the next page, he's now writing books called things like The Urban Crisis. So it's clear that the creative class and just bringing creativity into a city on its own is not enough. This diagram, in a rather joking way, suggests some of the things that go wrong in a city if you just bring in creativity. It's much more complex than that. So what's the truth behind this? I think the truth is something like a cargo cult. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but after the Second World War, in a lot of cities around the southern Pacific, local people regretted that the US forces that had been stayed with them and brought drugs and many other good things to the islands, medicines, they disappeared. And to try to bring back all that goodness, they built, out of local materials, all the things that the residents had had. They built bamboo aeroplanes, bamboo spectacles, bamboo satellite tracking stations. Nowadays, I think sometimes when we're trying to chase Silicon Valley, I feel like we're doing the same. We're building a cargo cult out of condominiums and co-working spaces. The truth is, building an ecosystem is more than physical infrastructure. So how do we tap into this thing that we might call startup DNA? Bill Owlett is a professor at MIT, and he put together this very simple explanation. We have small to medium-sized enterprises, and those are great, but they don't scale. If we want to build wealth in a city, we need innovation-driven enterprises. That is startup DNA. So where does it come from? Well, I think there's an interesting picture here that's made a lot of sense to many of the stakeholders I've worked with. It's from a book written about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, called The Alchemy of Growth. On the horizontal scale, it shows existing technologies, tomorrow's technologies, and on this scale here, it shows today's markets and future markets. Most organizations, large or small, are working with yesterday's technology in today's markets. When you do innovation in that space, you buy a solution off the shelf, you plug it in, and you expect it to work immediately. If I'm running a power plant, or an oil company, or a supermarket, I can't do all that startup stuff like failing fast, right? I can't do that. I've got people to feed. I've got customers to deliver to. I've got safety-critical systems to run. So when we talk about innovation, I think we need to be very clear which of these three horizons we're working on. In the second horizon, we're talking about technologies that are adjacent to what we're working with today and markets that we're adjacent to today. And then the third horizon is really where startups belong. This is the transformative zone where the really radical new ideas come from. So when we talk about innovation, I think we have to be clear which of those three things we're talking about, and we have to be clear that startups are only one part of the picture. Let's move on to the next slide. So innovation-driven entrepreneurship happens in that third horizon, up in the top right-hand corner. Very happy to send references to the papers involved and behind all this if anyone wants to read more about it. If you want to be an innovation-driven enterprise, whether you're big or small, these are the kinds of things you've got to do. You've got to act entrepreneurially, you've got to mitigate risk, and you've got to understand that if you stand still and don't innovate, that's the biggest risk of all. That's when you become Kodak. That's when you become Blockbuster Video. That's when you become disrupted. Let's move on. So innovation-driven entrepreneurship works in two phases. The first phase is about searching for a solution. And the second phase is what most people who've done an MBA have been trained to do, which is to execute that solution. Most large organizations have forgotten how to do the bit on the left. But if we're going to have a startup DNA that runs throughout a city, we're going to have startup thinking in government, well, then we need to have a capability back in our organizations for searching for new solutions and experimenting with them, just as Jonathan said this morning. Let's move on. Now, I'd like some guidance from our chairman here. I'm probably about 2 minutes away from my allotted slot. We lost some time in the beginning due to AV. Could I have an indication from the conference organizers? Do you want me to stick with 15 minutes and cut this halfway through, or do you want me to try and finish up? I've got 1 minute left, apparently. What would you like me to do? So can I have, you want me to carry on? You want me to cut it short? Which would you want me to do? You want me to carry on? Okay, thank you. I'll try and make this as quick as I can. So, again, for those of you not familiar with innovation, one of the fascinating things in the last 10 years has been the way that we've been able to systematize it. I'm 52 years old, and I can genuinely say I now have a mission in life, which is to teach entrepreneurship and to systematize innovation. I think this picture sums up the innovation part of that very well. If you want an innovation to survive, it has to be three things at the same time. It has to be technically feasible, it's got to work. It's got to be financially viable, it's got to generate value for somebody, and it's got to be desirable. And often we forget that desirable bit. We might put together a great grand plan that's going to revitalize our city, but forget that there's actually a whole series of diverse stakeholders who have to engage before it happens. So innovation, whether you're talking about the public sector, SMEs, or enterprises, happens in that center spot. And in terms of entrepreneurship, this is another of my heroes, a lady called Sarah Sarasvathy. She put together a model of what entrepreneurs do, and there are basically 5 things that successful entrepreneurs do. They're in the right-hand side. If you want to read more about her, I'm very happy to send you the link. But I think one of the most interesting things is that entrepreneurs, by nature, are co-creative. The World Wide Web has grown so fast because you don't have to build everything from scratch. If I launch a website today and I want maps of Kaohsiung right the way down to street level, I don't have to create a mapping application. I just make a link to Google Maps, and it's there. If I want payments, I make a link to Visa. It's done. 2 lines of code. 20 years ago, that was not the case. That's in the web, that's in a technology business, but it's happening throughout industry now. People are realizing that if we're more open in the way we work, if we connect with each other, if we co-create with our customers, if we're government, if we co-create with citizens, we can move faster to the future. And here's an example of that happening. In Europe, there's a collaboration called PROF, which brings together a group of about 30 hospital equipment suppliers. Every year, they'll focus on one aspect of a hospital, a maternity ward, a recovery room, and they'll work together to create a vision of what that might look like in the future. An integrated solution which a public sector hospital or a hospital system could buy because they know all the components will work together. We're also seeing the same thing happen in the financial sector around things like the R3 Consortium. And if you're interested in this work, I strongly recommend Henry Tresborough's books. Now in Singapore, this is a map of Singapore, rather pale on the screen here, we work very closely with Bosch. You might know it as a 120-year-old engineering company. Bosch is extremely collaborative-minded. And we brought together a whole series of Bosch's partners to explore how we can do open innovation together. Let's move on to the next slide. This is a picture of an event we ran to explore the issues involved in aging population. We brought together banks, engineering companies, food suppliers, all sorts of people to explore what kind of innovations could we come up with and build together. And that was a fascinating experience. I think what it revealed to me is that in any ecosystem, which I've shown here in green, there are kind of 3 levels of structure. If you actually want to build a startup ecosystem in your city, I think you need to be aware of these 3 levels. The green level is the city overall. At that level, you have conferences, you write things in newspapers. That's how the ecosystem talks to itself. Within the ecosystem, there will be groups of people who have specialized interests, people who run hospitals, people who do technology research, people who are interested in logistics. The actual innovation happens in what the academics call circles of action, when individual people come together to make innovation happen. And if you want startup DNA to really take root in your city, as we heard this morning, it's all about building community, and it's about building community on those 3 levels. Let's move forward. There's a role which is emerging and has not yet been fully defined, but it's that of an orchestrator, someone who can bring together people at different levels of community. Now, we're all here in this room because the city of Kaohsiung and the event organizers have orchestrated us to be here. We all know how to orchestrate a conference, but how do you orchestrate at the 2 levels below that? How do you run a circle of action in a fair legal way, and how do you orchestrate a community of interest? That learning is only just emerging. Let's move forward. So I want to end up with a thought now of perhaps how this applies to real cities, and I'm not as I say, not a city mayor or anything else. If you looked back 10 or 15 years, people like OECD would publish pictures like this. This is their model of a national innovation ecosystem. It's got all sorts of arrows and complicated things pushing this and pulling that, and it doesn't work, right? Why? Because it misses out people. Innovation happens because people make it happen, right? So if we're going to think about innovation in cities, we really need to think about people, and we need to think about them having a different mindset. Most of us, when we think of innovation, think of it starting with a lot of ideas, people in suits selecting the best ideas, engineers being hired to implement it, and finally salespeople being hired to sell the product or service. That worked very well for vacuum cleaners in the 1950s. It doesn't work very well for today's future. It's not agile enough. There's a different kind of process, different kind of framework, iterative learning type approaches, which you can see illustrated below. And again, if you want to follow up on that, happy to share some links for you. Let's move forward. If you bring that all together in a city, I think there is one other mental model which is really interesting and I suspect will transform the way that we plan and operate cities in the future. That's the concept of platform thinking. Most of us have been brought up in a world where we think of value chains, we think of stuff moving through an economy through several different levels of value adding and then finally being sold to a consumer. In the last 10 or 15 years, the explosive growth of huge companies like Amazon, Facebook, Instagram, all around the world, Google, has happened because they're built on a completely different model. They're built on what's called platform thinking. They're built on the idea that when you create a space, a bit like an old-fashioned market space in some ways, when people can come together, produce stuff, co-create stuff, and extract value from it, you can much more rapidly move towards a high-growth, scalable future. I won't go into the depths of that, but if you're interested, please do read this book by Sangeet Chowdhury, who's one of our mentors at JFDI, on platform thinking. It's absolutely fascinating. So if you think of a city as a platform, this is one illustration of it, which has been put together by some computer scientists. So as you'd expect, it's a slice through a city, and you could take many others. What I've done is to look and say, well, at these different levels of a city, what would a creative, startup-oriented city look like? So if you think, first of all, about the infrastructure level, it's got to work. Physicality still matters. Right? If the power doesn't work, if you can't connect to the internet, you can't do tech business. So that's number one. At the second level, you need to have the kind of legal and governance structures in place that make it possible for entrepreneurs, whether they're in the public sector or the private sector, to experiment and innovate. If you have a blaming, failure, intolerant legal structure, then you're not going to be able to innovate fast. I think there's another way of thinking about all the services which a city operates, which is to think of it as a living laboratory. One of the things that's been so powerful, I think, in Singapore is the continual urge by the government to experiment, using Singapore as a never-ending experiment, testing what works, and in a very agile way moving on from what doesn't work. I think if there's one thing that anyone here could learn from Singapore, it's that sense of using the country as a living laboratory. And finally, if we move on to the next slide, a really key part of it, I think, is involving citizens. I talked about co-creating. You may not realize, looking at these pictures on the left-hand side, these are actually civil servants from Singapore. I was leading them through an innovation workshop in which they were co-creating services for older people, and you can see they're having great fun doing it. They came into the workshop rather sensible, typically, feeling perhaps quite constrained by the environment they were working in. They went out realizing there was another way of doing co-creation. And I urge you to try this because it's great fun and a great way of motivating your workforce as well as getting results. So let's end up with a very rapid set of slides and run through to the end. There is a role for a catalyst. This is a map of the startup ecosystem drawn by a government agency in Singapore, and not surprisingly, you'll see it puts itself at the center. Now, Lily and I both were laughing over this at lunchtime. We both recognize that actually if you try to put yourself at the center of a startup ecosystem, no one will listen to you. Entrepreneurs are like cats. You can't herd them. You can put down a saucer of cream and they might come towards you. Be a catalyst, don't be a central feature. Second thing is, bear in mind you're not dealing with a machine. It is important to measure everything, as Jonathan said this morning, but don't expect if I put X in, I should get Y out. You need to learn what machine you're driving in your city before you can put real sensible metrics on it. The next thing is that I think we can talk about structures, we can talk about platforms, but at the end of the day, action happens with people. It's individual coders who write code. It's individual entrepreneurs who start business. It's individual civil servants who bring change into the public sector. So although we think about cities as being large physical objects, and they are, that's only one view of them. If you want startup DNA throughout your city, you need to perhaps start thinking bottom-up as well as top-down. And also remember that startups are only one part of this ecosystem. Your large established businesses are potentially a faster source of change and growth if you can energize them and give them confidence to work in new ways. This is perhaps a better picture of an innovation ecosystem, although I'm not sure how easy it is to apply anything that's illustrated there, other than saying that what matters in all of this is community and connection, as I think you heard from Jonathan this morning. I'm going to end with this mental model, this picture. I have a probable new role starting. I'm starting to explore helping the country of Kazakhstan to build a national innovation ecosystem. And as we've talked about building that ecosystem, I think the simple model that comes to mind is that in any city, you have a reputation, which you inherit from history, you have some wealth, and you have experience. You have some know-how in the city. I'm hoping later on Lily will tell us a little bit about what she's seen over her lifetime in terms of Singapore pulling itself up by its own bootstraps and building all three levels of wealth. Because it seems to me that those three things reinforce each other. If you can improve your reputation, you will attract capital. If you have capital, you'll be able to pay to gain new know-how. If you've got new know-how, your reputation will increase, and this thing will go spinning up. Yep, let's move on. Think of Silicon Valley. Its experience, its roots, are in the culture of organizations like Fairchild Semiconductor, one of the first modern tech companies. It has plenty of financial capital, and of course it has a reputation that we all recognize now in those brand names. When I first came to Singapore, we weren't there. We had a history as a trading nation. We had some great groundwork done by people who'd put in place angel networks and funding at various levels. But to be honest, as a startup ecosystem, in 2009, Singapore really was not on the radar. And in 10 years, that's been absolutely transformed. I didn't do it, my co-founder didn't do it, the community did it. We did it together. And that's the secret, really. So Singapore today looks very different. It now has some unicorns. That's a reputation indicator, if you like. It has an extraordinary amount of capital. Within 500 meters of my desk, there's something like $2 billion of early-stage finance. And of course, it still has a great history as a trading nation. When I look forward to Kazakhstan and Astana, where I shall probably be living from next month or so into the future, Astana has built an extraordinary, impressive technological place to do innovation. It's called Astana Hub. Please come and visit. It has a great history as a nomadic nation, and it has plenty of money, actually. It's a quite wealthy country. At the moment, it has no reputation. If I had not been to Singapore, and I had not been part of an extraordinary, exciting journey there, I wouldn't have the courage to take on this project. But I'm thoroughly looking forward to working in Astana, because I think there is every opportunity to take that ecosystem forward and to make it as successful as Singapore's is, without taking anything away from Singapore. In fact, in collaboration, not just with Singapore, but with all your cities too. So that, I think, is my last slide, if you'd like to move on. I left some questions up on the screen here. The brief I had before this event was that in our panel we were going to be discussing these issues. It may be, Steve, that we are now moved on from that, not sure. But anyway, thanks very much for listening.